So by now, you've probably heard about what is happening in Texas. At the instigation of Donald Trump, the Republican-controlled legislature is trying to redraw the state's legislative maps to be even more extreme partisan gerrymanders, so that Republicans have a lock on even more of Texas's congressional seats, and therefore a better chance of retaining control of the House of Representatives in the 2026 midterms and after. As with so many of the bad things happening to the country, this is being done at the urging of Donald Trump. But like many other bad things, it is also traceable to the United States Supreme Court. And that court could be on the precipice of making things even worse, as they are wont to do, allowing Republicans to redraw maps in ways that are even less democratic, less responsive to the people, and more likely to lock in Republicans' political control, even when voters want them out. Just hear me out. So what's happening in Texas concerns something called partisan gerrymandering, where politicians draw legislative districts to maximize one political party's advantage and that political party's ability to retain a majority of legislative seats, even when they don't win a majority of votes. So what happens is legislatures will pack a lot of one party's voters into a small number of districts and then spread the rest of the party's voters into other districts where they will always be in the minority. Partisan gerrymanders allow politicians to entrench themselves in office as against voters' preferences and above respect for popular will. Just take Wisconsin. Wisconsin had such an extreme gerrymander that even though the Republican Party received less than a majority of votes in an election, they still obtained a super majority of seats in one body of the state legislature. So partisan gerrymanders, in other words, screw up democracy. Legislatures and elections aren't really in a position to fix partisan gerrymandering because it's the legislatures doing the partisan gerrymandering, and because partisan gerrymandering skews elections, well, elections aren't a great tool for fixing them. In 2019, the United States Supreme Court said federal courts also cannot remedy partisan gerrymanders. So that decision, Rucho versus Common Cause, said that partisan gerrymanders have to be worked out by other branches, including the legislatures that are fucked up because of gerrymandering and messed up by gerrymandering. Because of that decision, Republican legislatures knew in the 2020 redistricting cycle and after that they could engage in as much partisan gerrymandering, in as extreme partisan gerrymanders as they could to try to outsmart democracy, and federal courts would be able to do diddly squat about that because of the United States Supreme Court. As Justice Elena Kagan warned in her dissent for the court's then four Democratic appointees, partisan gerrymandering has only gotten worse over time because technology and new redistricting software allow map makers to capture every last bit of partisan advantage. So the amped up methods for partisan gerrymandering, coupled with the Supreme Court removing possible constraints on gerrymandering, laid the groundwork for Republicans to gerrymander the shit out of legislatures to try to lock themselves into power in a giant FU to voters. And again, that is what they are seizing on in Texas. Oh, but it gets worse, because it seems that the Republican appointees on the court aren't content with just allowing Republicans to engage in partisan gerrymandering. They have also signaled they might be cool with Republican legislatures engaging in what is called racial gerrymandering, where legislatures use voters' race to draw districts. So in a decision from last summer, Alexander versus South Carolina Conference of the NAACP, the Supreme Court basically said, what's the big deal if Republican legislatures draw districts that happen to make it so the districts have certain percentages of Black voters who are locked into being political minorities in several districts? Because they observed the correlation between race and partisan affiliation, any maps that are drawn to advantage Republicans are, likely to disadvantage Black voters. And they seem to view that as just an acceptable cost of allowing Republicans to engage in partisan gerrymandering. That is, the Republican appointees seem to think Republicans are so entitled to draw districts that advantage themselves at the expense of voters, they can disempower Black voters by diluting their political power. And it could get even worse. So there remains a protection in federal law, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, for minority voters and voters of color. So that law was amended in the 1980s to prevent states from drawing districts in ways that have the effect of disadvantaging Black voters. So in the wake of the 2020 redistricting, when Republicans were scrambling to draw maps that maximize their political power, states drew maps that, surprise, ensured that Black voters would be political minorities in several districts, rather than making up majorities in districts and having political opportunities. So, in the wake of that redistricting, courts struck down several of those maps in Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia, just to name a few places. Those lower courts said the Voting Rights Act and its prohibition on racial discrimination in voting do not allow legislatures to draw maps that dilute Black voters' political power when legislatures could easily draw obvious districts where Black voters would have real political opportunities. But the United States Supreme Court put several of those decisions on hold, allowing states to conduct the 2022 midterms under maps that violated the Voting Rights Act. What did that do? It erased several districts that had elected Democratic representatives with the support of Black voters. And it turned over those districts to Republicans. And guess what? Republicans won control of the House of Representatives with those maps in place. And honestly, by a margin of seats that is just about the number of seats that the Supreme Court handed them by allowing states to violate the Voting Rights Act. Now, after the midterms, after Republicans wrung the political advantage from those illegal maps, the Supreme Court came back and said, you know what, whoopsie, our bad. Those maps, they do violate the Voting Rights Act after all. Now, where are we? We are in the lead up to the 2026 midterms. And what did the Republican justices just signal? That they now want to decide whether the Voting Rights Act and its remaining protections for democracy and minority voters are unconstitutional. So on Friday evening, August 1st, the Supreme Court released an order asking the parties in one of their cases for this upcoming term to brief the question of whether complying with the Voting Rights Act by ensuring Black voters are represented is unconstitutional racial discrimination. Yes, the Republican appointees may be poised to say that it is unconstitutional racial discrimination against white voters to block white Republicans from discriminating against Black voters. And if they do that, well, we know what effect that's going to have. It will allow states to draw maps that erase even more Democratic-held districts by erasing representation and political opportunities for voters of color. That's what happened when the United States Supreme Court effectively suspended the operation of the Voting Rights Act during the 2022 midterms. So, to take stock, the United States Supreme Court cleared the way for partisan gerrymandering, where legislatures draw maps in ways that entrench their political power, the political power of one political party. And that has enabled the anti-democratic power grab underway in Texas. And the United States Supreme Court may now be on the verge of clearing the way for racial gerrymandering, where legislatures can draw maps that dilute the political power of minority voters, denying them political representation. And again, we know that when the United States Supreme Court effectively suspended the operation of the Voting Rights Act during the 2022 midterms, that had the same effect as greenlighting partisan gerrymandering in that it enabled more anti-democratic power grabs that allowed politicians to try to outsmart multiracial democracy and the will of the voters. So it is not just Donald Trump corroding our democracy and who is responsible for the unfolding situation in Texas and elsewhere. It's the Republican-controlled Supreme Court who lets the Republican Party do it.